Hello from Cyprus. I am at the church, the little chapel of Agia Thekla near Agia Napa and near Sotira. And I would like to talk to you today a little bit about a very major and important topic, the topic of the filioque. A lot of people are confused about where it came from, why it came into the creed, and how it how that happened, what was the process. And I would like to tell you what I learned over the years, especially my work doing my PhD, where I read the history, I studied it quite extensively, and I would like to give you some of that information. I did my PhD at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. My professors were primarily Roman Catholics, and although they were very patristically oriented, and they were excellent professors, excellent teachers, and they were researchers, they were scholars in the field of history and theology and patristic theology. And so I have a unique perspective in that way, given to me by them, and my studies of the history of that period. So the filioque uh, came into the creed during the time when the Western Church and the Western Roman Empire were being ransacked by the Franks. Before the Franks, there were many other Germanic tribes that came into the Western Empire and even attacked the Eastern Empire. And here, let me just add that there is a misconception about when the church was actually divided and when the schism happened. And many people will send you to 1054 AD. But in fact, the division of the church began in the 4th century, when the Goths and Visigoths and all the barbarians of the north, Germanic tribes, they invaded Europe, they invaded the Western European continent, and in 410 AD, 410, Alaric, the Visigoth king, actually captured Rome and reduced it to a village. Okay, so the significance of Rome fell. Even though the Western Empire lasted a few more years, significance of Rome was reduced to basically nothing because it was more like a village. And that is one of the reasons that the Western Church, and Rome in particular, which was really representing the Western Church, did not really participate very much, did not contribute very much in the subsequent great councils of the Church. And they were sent into 400 years at least, or even more, of what we call the Dark Ages of Europe. Okay, some people don't think of the Dark Ages of Europe as those, but in fact, those were the Dark Ages of Europe, where civilization was completely destroyed. The philosophers, the Greek philosophers, were completely lost to them. Science, as was developed again by the Greeks and the early Romans, was completely eliminated, and learning was eliminated. There were no schools to speak of. Some of the monasteries were able to retain some learning, but very little. The West lost their connection with the East, also linguistically, not only administratively and governmentally, but also linguistically. So the fathers of the West, primarily Augustine, but also the others, did not know any Greek to read the Greek fathers, who were very prolific in developing theology, in commentaries on the Bible and things like that, which are a treasure for us today. So, as the invading forces of the uh, Germanic tribes continued, the Franks came in and they invaded Spain. The Franks were influenced by Arians. They were actually converted to Christianity by Arians. And in their understanding, uh, Jesus was lower than the Father and was created by the Father. They were not educated, of course, so they really didn't have any theology to speak of, but they had this understanding that Jesus was lower than the Father. In other words, the second person of the Holy Trinity, the Son, was not equal to the Father. So the bishops of Spain, who were Orthodox Christians, they were Orthodox bishops, and they knew that this was an important aspect of Christianity and the faith. They decided in a council to insert into the creed a word, a Latin word, because they were now all Latin speakers, a word, filioque, and by the Son, which would make the Son equal to the Father, where the creed says, and I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father. They added, and by the Son, proceeds from the Father, and by the Son, and from the Son. So, this filioque was inserted in Spain in order to protect the equality of the Son with the Father. And unfortunately, this was propagated by the Franks wherever the Franks were in control of lands in Europe. Finally, this happened in the middle of the 6th century, in the mid 500s. So, as the Franks propagated this as the correct creed, we progress further and we reach the year 800, where Charlemagne, who was the king of the Franks, was able to put under his authority most of the European continent, including Italy. And in so doing, he did several things, a lot of things which changed completely the Western Church and established several things that were to remain as part of the Western understanding, which really is the time when we see the knife go straight through the bone of the church. And Charlemagne is really the one who truly divided the church theologically and administratively, and created new ideas of what the church is about and how the church is run, and who is Orthodox and who is not Orthodox, and what the faith should be about, and how the Western church should be. And he claimed that the Eastern Church were pagans. He called them the Greeks in a derogatory way, unless they would come under his authority. He basically convinced or forced the Bishop of Rome, which now was being upgraded. He convinced the Bishop of Rome, Leo the Third, to crown him as the Holy Roman Emperor. And he elevated the See of Rome into the head of the church, and gave supreme authority to the Bishop of Rome over all bishops, because the Bishop of Rome was the only one that could actually claim continuity with the apostles in the West. In the East, of course, we had many churches that were, Alexandria and Jerusalem, of course, and Antioch, and even Constantinople. and even the Church of Cyprus, they could claim continuity with the apostles, but in the West, only Rome could do that. And so, one of the things that Charlemagne did was to, and not Charlemagne in the sense, his theologians did this. The Carolingian theologians are the ones who become very prominent theologians now, and they're the ones that guide the development of the Western Church from here on. The things the things that remained in the Roman Catholic Church and eventually even in the Protestant world in the centuries following this. So we're in the 800s. The Bishop of Rome is proclaimed to be the supreme authority over all Christians, and anybody who doesn't submit to him by the decision of Charlemagne, anybody who doesn't submit to him is not a Christian, including the whole Eastern Roman Empire, which continues to thrive, and where Christianity is really lived in a very deep way because they are uninterrupted. And one of the main things that is imposed on the West is the filioque. They actually they forged what they called the Athanasian Creed that included the filioque, and they imposed it on the church as if it was from St. Athanasius. And the other thing they forged was a document called the Donatum of Constantine, in which they were claiming that Constantine gave the Bishop of Rome supreme authority over all the church. So these things are amazing because they're changing the Western Church, they're changing the Church of Rome, and they're convincing the European continent of the superiority of the Bishop of Rome over them. But what Charlemagne did is that he placed the Bishop of Rome under his authority, so he controlled everything that was done, and he created this Holy Roman Empire, which everybody says today was neither holy nor Roman, and he was neither a Holy Roman Emperor or anything else. He was a Frankish king who was imposing his will on the Romans of the time in the West. The Bishop of Rome at the time, Leo III, who was the one that crowned Charlemagne, knew that the filioque did not belong in the creed. So what he did was he inscribed the creed without the filioque on silver plaques, and he had it placed in the Church of St. Peter's in Rome, everywhere. He had it placed everywhere, so that he would preserve the creed without the filioque as he knew it, as he understood it. Well, upon his death, a Frankish bishop was installed in Rome, and they removed the plaques, and they enforced the filioque on the entire Western Church. Another thing that Charlemagne did through the work of the Frankish theologians, the Carolingian theologians, is that the imposition of the unleavened bread in the Eucharist. And their whole idea was on the interpretation of whether the last meal of Christ with the apostles, the Last Supper, was actually made of leaven or unleavened bread. And they claimed that it was a Paschal meal, although in fact it was on Thursday, not on Friday. And they claimed that it was a Paschal meal, which would be an unleavened, it would include unleavened bread. The other thing that the Carolingian theologians did through Charlemagne, or Charlemagne through their help, was to impose the celibate priesthood on the entire Western Church. And he did this so that he can actually control the priests. He created an army of priests, like his own army, and he could bring them anywhere he wanted, because they would be unattached to the family and are attached to anything that will make them, that will prevent them from going wherever they were sent. So other things were also introduced, but these were the main major things that were done at the time by Charlemagne and the Carolingian theologians. But the major one that the Western fathers, the Western bishops eventually realized some years later, not very long later, along with the authority of the Bishop of Rome, which was claimed upon them at the time of Saint Photius the Great, when Photius was removed and reinstalled, and they got the synods, the two synods, one that removed him and the other reinstalled him. We have what we call the debate about the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, and we also have the debate about the filioque, which the fathers eventually rejected in what we call the Eighth Ecumenical Council, and the condemnation of the filioque, not of the Western Church, but of the filioque. This is very important again. I remember today, of course, some of our people have given the impression that they want to compromise and kind of explain away the filioque so that they can reunite with the Roman Catholics, but it really doesn't work very well. Because if you really understand the filioque correctly, then you will realize that it doesn't fit theologically in the creed. Okay? First, because of the fact that in the Greek originally, there are the two words that are distinctive, which make the difference and create the difference between the Holy Spirit and Christ so that they won't be confused, and they show the generation of each one. The one is for Christ, that he is genate, he is begotten, and of the Spirit that he proceeds. So these two words are from the Gospel of John. St. John the Evangelist is not using the same word for both, because he wants to distinguish the two persons of the Holy Trinity and the relationship with the Father. So the word is the word that he uses for the Holy Spirit, ekporevete, or proceeds, cannot be used for the relation between the Father and the Son. And the word genate cannot be used to denote the relation between the Spirit and the Father. And it cannot be used to relate, to show the relation between the Son and the Spirit either. Those two terms are unique for the relationship of the Son and the Spirit to the Father. The word that St. John uses, and Christ himself uses, is apostello. I will send the Spirit to you when I ascend to heaven. So the Son sends the Spirit, but the Spirit is sort of begotten from the Father, proceeds from the Father. Okay? And the Father sends the Son, and the Son sends the Spirit, but the Son is begotten from the Father, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father, and that's how the three are in one Holy Trinity. So I remember when I was at Catholic U, and one of our professors, who was an English professor, his name was Robert Marcus, Professor Robert Marcus. You find him, he's very well known. He's written many things. He taught in England. He was a Roman Catholic. He was in class and he was talking to us about what happened during that time when the filioque was introduced into the creed in Spain. And he says in a very emphatic way that the filioque, was a historical accident and it does not belong there. So later, after the class ended, I went to his office to talk about my midterm paper with him, and I said, Professor Marcos, you said that the filioque does not belong in the creed, but aren't you Roman Catholic? He says, yes, I am. And I said, well, I mean, when you go to church, what do you do? I mean, they're saying this. He says, I do not say it. And in that way, he was emphasizing that he was in disagreement with what the current state of the situation is in the Roman Church, where they are actually still using the filioque, although their scholars, their professors in their universities are teaching that it doesn't belong there. And I hope that someday they will remove it. Some of the Protestants have already removed it because they realize that it doesn't belong there. Clearly, it doesn't belong there. So there is no way for us to compromise on this as Orthodox. It wouldn't be right. It would confuse the relationships between the three persons of the Trinity theologically, and there would be no terminology that would be able to satisfy what we already have there, which is given by St. John the Evangelist in the Gospel of John. And the filioque, I hope and pray that someday the Roman Catholics and everyone else who use it will remove it from the creed, and they will agree that indeed it does not belong there. Thank you.